Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Beth Carlin, and I am serving as Interim Director of Alumni Engagement here at UNCG. I want to welcome you all to our session of Alumni All Access today. Thanks so much for sharing your Monday after Thanksgiving with us. Before we get started, I want to briefly introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Omar H is Dean of Lloyd International Honors College and a professor in the College of Arts and Sciences. He received his PhD in history from Columbia University, and in 2016 was named the Carnegie Foundation North Carolina Professor of the Year. And we are so excited to have him with us today to present his talk entitled Homo sapiens, not a know-it-allis, towards a non-epistemological approach to learning. After his presentation, we'll have a brief discussion period, so definitely drop your questions or comments in the Q&A panel as you think of them, so I'll be able to share them when we're done. And so without further ado, I'll hand it off to Dr. Ali. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me, Beth. Thank you so much for all of you who took the time to come this morning and be here. I can't see you, but I can imagine that you have very smiley faces, that you're all very beautiful, handsome human beings and full of energy and curiosity. So I'm very happy to know that you're out there. At least that's my imagination, thinking about who you are out there. But thank you so much for engaging with us here this morning. So as Beth mentioned, I serve as the Dean of the Honors College here. I've had the privilege of doing so for the last almost 9 years now. And I also teach history. I teach world history, looking at different areas of what's called the global African diaspora. That's my my specialization. But I have many interests, like I'm sure all of you, because that's why you're here. Why would you be doing this otherwise? You know, you're, I guess, what we consider lifelong learners. I recently had a wonderful class with the Emeritus Society, which is always a pleasure to engage with. So I decided to come up with something a title that was super bizarre and not particularly accessible. And I wanted to do that just to be playful. So just in the chat, if you would, has anybody ever heard of Homo notanowitalis before? Has anybody heard of them? If you want to put it in the chat, you can just keep it simple and say yes, no, what, whatever you want to say. So let me give you a second to kind of respond here to that question of Homo notanowitalis. Mm-hmm. Oh, there's somebody who's answering. Let's see. Nope. Okay. So I see a nope coming in. All right. Any others? Any other things you would like to share? And maybe you're just too tired to respond. So I will take this as you not knowing necessarily, maybe not being sure. So of course, Homo notanowitalis is a made up hominid or hominin. There's been a change in anthropology to talk about hominin as opposed to hominids. And I sort of am playing with this idea of the Latin binomial, the scientific terms for people and plants and all kinds of things. So Homo not a know-it-allis is somebody who is not a know-it-all. And I say this because in some ways, these categories that we've come up with in anthropology, in sociobiology, are made up. Some people make up these terms to try to capture what they understand is part of the human evolutionary process of our earlier ancestors. And so who knows? Maybe at some point this will catch as a defining moment of a new kind of species. And I think that we went through a process of human evolution that literally goes back, we're talking about 2 million years. So I thought I would just talk a little bit about human evolution, broadly speaking, and bring us up to speed in terms of where we are at right now as a species, as far as I can tell. So we're pretty amazing, actually, creatures, us human beings. And we are one of a number of hominid species that was around that basically survived. So you may have heard of Neanderthals, of course. Turns out many of us who have any European ancestry probably have a little bit of Neanderthal in us as well, because people were able to interbreed. And we have descendants, we're descendants of other elements of the family tree. So we basically emerge as hominids, several million years ago. But the one hominid that I'm a huge fan of, in fact, I might have a T-shirt of, is Homo erectus. And Homo erectus is, of course, upright person. But the reason why they're amazing is because they were able to migrate successfully out of Africa. So our species originates somewhere in East Africa. There's now evidence to suggest even parts of North Africa, which is amazing. But most of the consensus is that we emerged somewhere in East and Southeast Africa. And where there's archaeological evidence of not just in terms of our bones, our skeletal remains, but also our art. The famous Blombos caves in South Africa are an example of that, where for many generations people were living and creating art in these caves, not very far from the ocean, as it turns out. And so we emerged there. But Homo erectus is a pretty awesome ancestor of ours. And they basically came out of Africa and spread across much of the world. And the way that they were able to do that is because somewhere around 1 million years ago, they figured out how to control fire, right? So when you think about the history of science, like, oh my gosh, being able to control fire is like a big to-do. Why is it so important? Because it allows you to move into colder climates, because you can, keep yourself warm. But you also are going to develop your ability to metabolize and to take in nutrients and break down food, so that you're not spending as much time doing the kind of work to just make carcasses edible. You can break down the food much faster, so your body doesn't have to do it, and you're able to essentially create a more developed prefrontal cortex, and that part of our brain is what allows us to imagine. So basically, when you have control over fire, you're able to move into areas that are colder climates. You're able to metabolize, which allows for basically a larger prefrontal cortex. In fact, your entire brain. Our social skills emerge during this time period. We don't know exactly when language emerges, but some kind of storytelling does emerge sometime between 1 million years ago to at least about 70,000 years ago, because the thinking right now among paleoanthropologists and anthropologists generally is that we've known that we're tool makers, but there are other animals that are tool makers as well. We know that certain types of primates also use sticks to get ants, for instance, out of anthills. Even birds will drop things from a distance to break them to get to the meat, seeds. So there's different ways in which other animals, which we are, use tools. But one of the really defining characteristics of being human is our sociability and our ability to kind of command groups of people to maximize our chances of reproducing. And so probably the people who emerge as leaders are those who could command the attention of their fellow, hominid around, campfires, tell good stories, motivate people to decide to go on a journey beyond what they've known. So that's a defining feature of our species. And so our development continues to grow, across the world. And at a certain point, there were about 5 or 6 competing hominid species. Again, I mentioned, Neanderthals, Homo neanderthal, but there's also about 5 more that were coexistent for a very brief period of time, going back about 80,000 years ago, which is really amazing when you think about that. And at some point, our species just sort of either killed the rest off, or others died off on their own. There's probably some combination. There was competition, and we emerge. And so we start to create a sedentary society. many thousands of years later with what's called the Neolithic Revolution, which was our ability to start to farm and to domesticate animals. And that's when you start to see sort of stratification in society, because we become sedentary from being nomadic, from moving from one place to another, to settling down and creating some of those first cities like Ur, which is mentioned in the Bible, for instance, and Uruk and others. And that in some ways creates a new kind of stratification that will allow for people to develop new kinds of abilities. And so our science and technology, our arts really start to develop in new ways. And we begin to use language to disseminate information, and writing in particular, about 3,500, 4,000 years ago. And that allowed for the development of shared collective knowledge to grow. And our population is still relatively small at this point in time. If you were to look at a graph, you would basically see that our population was, around the world, a couple million people, not many, and then it shoots up as we start to become sedentary, and we start to see massive populations in these city centers. So the reason why I call this talk Homo notalis, not a notalis, is because with the rise of sedentary societies, we start to write things down and start to become these knowers in a more rigid way. Not to say that there weren't know-it-alls back in the earlier time periods, but there's a kind of a truth that gets sort of codified. And we see that in the religious traditions, but in larger cultural traditions, this is the only way to be, and this is a better way to be. Morality gets placed into that. And ways of understanding who we are as human beings separate from nature start to emerge. There's a lot of evidence when we look at ethnographic work of civilizations that still existed in the 20th century that were seen as less connected to our global centers, that they had a more nuanced understanding of their relationship to nature, that we are part of the animal kingdom, that our origin stories, the creation myths that you see abound in different parts of the world, whether it's in Europe or in Africa or in parts of the Americas or East Asia, have these animals as sort of our progenitors, and we originate from other animals and are an extension of the animal family. But the notion that humans are completely distinct is relatively modern. It's only in the last, couple thousand years that we begin to see ourselves as really separate from nature. And so this has huge implications because we become increasingly egocentric. And what happens is that the model of learning, the model of development becomes much more individuated. And that accelerates and really comes to a head, when we move into the last 500 years or so. Artists did not usually write their names down with the artworks that they had up until the last 1,000 years or 1,500 years. People just produced art, and people didn't attach a name per se to them. But the idea of the individual is a very, very modern concept. And in some ways, we collectively and individually suffer of what's a fancy word called solipsism, this idea that we as individuals exist separate from those around us. And it really goes against who we are as social creatures. We are, if we're born, it takes a good, at least 5 years for babies to be at least a little bit, independent. My own experience, I have my data sample is 2. I have a daughter and a son, and, they're like pretty useless until they get to be, at least 5, 6, 7 years old. They're completely dependent on us, the older, people in the household. And so we are inextricably connected to those around us for the first many, many years. And we cannot survive without each other. While there are other animals that, the mother drops them out of their womb, like a giraffe falls, and is pretty much walking within like a few minutes and off and doing their thing. Now they need some protection, but we're highly dependent on each other is the point here. Or more positively put, we're very social. So what has happened is that we've become socialized into thinking in the last few hundred years that learning is individuated. And I think that the person whose work I've been most influenced by is somebody named Lev Vygotsky. For those of you who maybe studied education or psychology might be familiar with some of his work. He was an early 20th century Russian educator, a psychologist. You know, in some ways, the boundaries between these things is more blurred. And he was living in a time where there was a lot of experimentation going on in Russia. This is, you know, just after the Bolshevik Revolution into the 20s and early 30s, before things really clamped down intellectually and otherwise in what would be the Soviet Union. And he was sort of the person who is a founder of what we call special education, but his insights into learning and language development, I think, are very, very important. In fact, I believe it's appropriate to say that they were revolutionary. And much of his work was not in some ways taught and known in you know, the West, in terms of the European West and the United States for a number of decades. But there were basically two views of human development that emerge in that first half of the 20th century. One, which becomes the one that we have mostly adopted in our society, is that of Jean Piaget, who believed that humans develop in certain stages, right? And then in some ways, there's something very intuitive about that, because I think we look at our babies in our own house, or family members, cousins, nephews, nieces, just other children out there, and you see that they develop a certain amount of capacities at this age, and then a certain amount at that age, and a certain amount at that age. But you know, it's not clear if you can cut it off exactly at 7 years old or 8 years old or what have you. But there's this idea that there are these stages of development, and that's again, there's certainly something intuitive. It's kind of like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But what's intuitive oftentimes is something that is socially produced. So, you know, what's obvious to us may not be obvious to other people who come from different cultures and time periods. And the other view, if you will, and I'm really simplifying this, is that of Vygotsky, who had this other view of human development, which was less about stages, but more about this process where, and he uses the example of language learning to express this, where a person who is a language speaker, like an older sibling or a parent, relates to the language learner, the toddler, say, as if they're capable of speaking the language before that toddler actually knows how to speak the language, while that toddler is essentially babbling their way into becoming a language learner. Okay, so what does that look like? Basically, if you have an older sibling, say Joey, and their younger sibling is Bobby, if Bobby goes and kind of looks around and goes, Dad, the bottle? And basically the older sibling will say, oh, do you want the bottle? They're relating to the younger sibling as if they're a language speaker before that babbling child knows how to fully articulate things. So they might say, ball, and the older sibling knows that they're trying to get to bottle because they're pointing to the thing, but they relate to them as if they're a language speaker. Now, this may seem very obvious because we kind of do it, quote, naturally, but we do that all the time with children. We don't like, so for instance, we don't say, okay, I think what you're trying to say, little Bobby, is bottle, but please learn the entire lexicon of the English language and the grammar, and then come back to me and we can discuss this. We don't do that. We just relate to them as if they're a language speaker. And so this insight that Lev Vygotsky has about how we learn language is something that others have taken and used to understand how humans can continue to relate to each other as ahead of each other, or as babbling into becoming that other thing across the rest of our lives. So one of the fascinating things when you look at little kids is that they are very playful. They're constantly playing, they're imagining, they're using a lot of their prefrontal cortex to imagine things, scenes that they're in. They're like a fireman, they're, you know, a teacher, they're, you know, Wonder Woman, they're whatever they are. And they look around, you know, and they kind of come up with things. They make things that, like this, you know, what I'm holding here, if I was to say, what is this? most adults would say this is a pen. But for a child, they think of it as like maybe a spaceship, right? Or, a bat, or a laser beam, a laser, what is it called? A laser, what is the thing in Star Wars? A laser something. Beth, what is that?
A lightsaber.
Lightsaber!
We knew what you meant.
Yeah, thank you. Lightsaber, right? So you could, and there's these fascinating psychology studies where you could take a paper clip and you ask adults, what can this thing be used for? What is it? They come up with, at least I think it's like 16 different things that they come up with. But children come up with like dozens and dozens and dozens of things. Their ability to be more imaginative in some ways is there until we start to tell them, no, that is a paper clip that's used to keep two pieces of paper together. And one of the fascinating things as an educator at a university is that we both expand the minds of students because we introduce them, expose them to new fields of study, new ways of looking at things, new methodologies. But at the same time, we do this thing called discipline. That is, they learn a discipline. They learn the major, like, for me as a historian, learning how to properly footnote, that this is the way to look at this. This is the way to look at that. This is how you cite it. And there's all these sort of conventions. And there's a disciplinary training. So in some ways, we're both expanding our vistas, but we're also becoming more narrow. It's a fascinating sort of paradox or contradiction that I've never been able to fully wrap my head around. But children have this capacity to think very broadly, very creatively, in ways that we lose that as adults because we're told to get serious, stop playing, get to work. We are this thing. We are a student. We are a teacher. We are a father. We are a mother. We are a mailman. We're a firewoman. We're whatever it is. We're an engineer. We have these roles that we play in society, and we're less sort of fluid. So children have this capacity to play, to babble more freely. I mean, a child that is able to basically start to vocalize things, 1 year old or even younger, within a few years is learning Mandarin, right? I mean, how many of us within, say, 3 or 4 years could be Mandarin fluently? Well, turns out children do all over the world. There are millions of children that do that. Millions of children learn French within, 3 years. And the reason why, and English and Kiswahili and Urdu and Arabic and, all the languages, because they're constantly playing and willing to babble, and people relate to them as if they're language speakers. So that's a fascinating insight. So one of the things that we stop doing is relating to each other as if we're capable of doing this or that. We talk about, like in the universities, I'm always kind of pushing back against the sort of the bifurcation of the sciences versus the humanities, right? But, what is the difference? There's both are asking questions, both are observing, both are playing with ideas, both are expressing themselves. But we make these distinctions. We separate us. Oh, I'm not good at math. Oh, I'm not a poet. Oh, I'm not an artist. They're an artist. Oh, you don't do that. So we do these separations. Children don't do that. They're much more willing to just kind of be whoever. I mean, you can be Batman one day, then Wonder Woman the next day, and then, your kid brother the next moment even. So it takes two to do this. It takes the willingness to babble, but it also takes the willingness of the person who's more developed in that particular area of life, language, hairdressing, biology, whatever it is, to relate to the person who's not as developed in that particular area of life as if they are. So what that means is for us to stop being such know-it-alls, because being a know-it-all actually keeps us from learning and developing as both the babbling part of us and also the person who can relate to others as if they're part of that area of life in a more developed way. So this insight that Vygotsky offers is truly revolutionary, because what we can do is take the methodology of learning through babbling, through play, through acting as if those around us are, quote, a head taller than they are, which is the language that Vygotsky uses, who also actually offers this really fascinating word in Russian. It's obuchnie, which means teach, learn. So we often separate the teacher from the learner, but there's words in Russian, also in Mandarin, that combine sort of it's the agglutinative kind of thing where you're combining teach, learn, an appreciation for teachers being learners, learners being teachers. So there's a symbiotic relationship there, an interplay, a dialectic, if you will. So why I call this, Homo notanowitalis is because I wanted to raise this issue of us in the Honors College. I think the best teachers on campus do this, the best students do this, is that they don't limit themselves by these categories of being not, being not an artist, not good at math, not this, not that, but just willing to play and babble and fumble around. And those teachers who relate to their students as capable before they're actually able to do X, Y, or Z. And I would venture to say that everyone on this call has had someone in their life who just kind of believes in them. They don't even necessarily have to say the words, I believe in you. Their posture is such that they just sort of believe in you. And that is the way in which I think that we are uplifted. And I bet maybe we could take another moment here as you could put into the chat a person in your life who just believes in you. It could be your mother, it could be your best friend, it could be, one of your teachers. Their attitude towards you is, you got this, you got it. It's like, of course, no brainer, right? Like, who has that in their life? I will put into the chat. Let me see. I will put my father, I call him my Abu, and my mama, and my darling wife, Deanna, and my friend Linda, and Naja, and Jasmine. Those are people who just kind of like, they relate to me like, of course, you got this, right? And how powerful is that, right? To have those people in our lives who could do that. I'm getting some weird messages here. Okay, good. So, I think that those of us who have that, I think it's all of us, there's at least one person, are very fortunate. And I think that this is something that we can do for other human beings. And this is what I talk about in my classes. Apart from the content of what I'm teaching, I always say it's really important to have, to really take in that you have these superpowers. And one of the superpowers that you have is to be able to actually express gratitude and change your own emotionality when you're feeling a little out of sorts. But the other thing that you all have is your ability to relate to other people around you. And that can be a parent, like a child relating to their parent as ahead of themselves, or a friend or a classmate or whoever, and just have that posture of believing in them and taking what they have to say seriously. And if you do that, the chances of that person learning and growing is dramatically increased. Because what's the opposite of that? The opposite is basically poo-pooing people, saying, oh no, that's not your thing. No, that's not your thing. No, stay in your lane, right? That's there's two things that really bother me, and you'll be surprised. Some of you will be surprised about one of them. When people say to stay in your lane, like, to me, that's offensive. Like, why? Why would you want to stay in your lane? That's undevelopmental and that's not growthful. But it's also, the other thing that bothers me when people say it's like happy Monday or happy Friday. No, I might be really annoyed this Monday or Friday. Don't tell me to be happy. So it seems weird because I'm kind of a happy puppy kind of person. But when people tell me that, I'm like, don't say that. It bothers me. So that's very undevelopmental. I know I'm immature in this way, and I should just let people say that and not get annoyed. But I think it's more interesting to ask people, oh, how was your day? Are you having a good day? A question, as opposed to saying happy whatever and asserting your emotional state on the other person. But that's just my pet peeve, which is a little odd, I know. So I think going back to this is that we have that power to give to others that boost of encouragement and affirmation for them to learn X, Y, or Z. And for me, this is extremely relevant because if we want to teach the next generation of scientists, artists, humanists, mathematicians, engineers, musicians, cooks, gardeners, trash collectors, whatever it is, you have to, in some ways, express that believing in them sentiment and relating to them ahead of themselves. So the opposite of that is being a know-it-all, acting as if you know it all, which really kills, in some ways, the spirit of most people when you're surrounded by people who are know-it-alls. And it doesn't allow you yourself as the know-it-all to grow. And it's really true. The more you know about a field of study, the more you realize you don't know. And anybody who has a PhD in X, Y, or Z, or has, years of experience doing X, Y, or Z as gardening or cooking or mending things or just running a household or whatever it is, knows that the more you know about the details of it, the more you realize, we're all kind of making it up and trying to figure things out. So that's kind of what I wanted to present, is in some ways the antidote to being a know-it-all is to be a grow-it-all. That is, to help others grow and learn by relating to them ahead of themselves, showing that patience, asking them questions, literally nodding your head when they're talking, affirming their humanity, and supporting their development. And if we do that for each other, we will continue to be the obuchnias that Vygotsky describes, the teacher, learners, learner, teachers. So those are my comments. And maybe if you have questions, we can open things up. And I can hear the applause. It's like really loud. It's like deafening. Oh my gosh. Thank you all. Thank you. Anyways, that's me relating to you as good applauders and listeners. So with that, let's open things up. What do you think, Beth?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think everyone can sort of take something away from this approach. I think a lot of times, and I'll disclose it, a PhD program in English. And so I know what you're talking about. I recognize it when we sort of cocoon ourselves in our disciplines and we sort of draw hard lines, around things. And I think it's there's this kind of generosity that I recognize in what you're talking about, where people don't do that, where there's an invitation to learn and to share, and also an assumption that that person is ready and receptive for that information, right? So I think that's really beautiful. And the way that could work in the same way as the way we pass on language learning to children. When I was like a new mom, I have a 7-year-old. I remember distinctly thinking and being sort of surprised that, we've been having children as a species for how long now? And it is still the same process. Like, children still have the same sort of abilities at the same ages. And just sort of reflecting on that and being really surprised that, evolution hasn't changed something in however many thousands or million years, So anyway, those are just my comments. I just wanted it, but absolutely, please feel free to share your Q&A questions or comments while, we can just talk. I liked while people are maybe thinking about what they'd like to ask or comment, or if they have a good joke, I'm always open. I think what you said about generosity and beauty and linking those two, I think is really is how I think about it. I think that people who are like, I was recently asked, I was talking to our provost, Debbie Storrs, Dr. Debbie Storrs, and she was asking, so, we were just talking about things in our professional development and things like that. She says, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, well, I think I want to be one of the really like those old people that are just really patient with others. They just kind of like are willing to kind of not only just speak more slowly, but just really be really good listeners and just be present. And because I so appreciate people who do that. And my experience is people who do that are relating to you like you have something to give in the world. And so it's very generous and beautiful to do that for other people, to give that gift of
your attention and your time and that affirmation. And so I really liked you linking generosity and beauty, because I do think that it's a human activity that's very, very beautiful. So I like that phrasing.
Yeah, no, I think what you're describing is sort of the opposite of the, the curmudgeon whose world just gets smaller and smaller and tighter the older they get, and sort of get off my lawn attitude.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I think staying generous and even becoming more generous as you get older is something we should all aspire to.
Yeah, it's good. So what are you doing in your PhD program? What do you want to research?
Yeah, so I'm working on 19th century American seafaring literature.
Wow.
So sailor narratives and the way people write about going to sea and how it's sort of always the same. There's a script that people follow, and how they sort of negotiate those expectations that they bring to the genre. So yeah, it's interesting for me. I've been in the Navy for 19 years now. So it's sort of a full circle thing for me.
So you say you've been in the Navy, so you still how do you how does that work?
No, I was active duty for about 6 years, and I've been in the reserves ever since.
Oh, okay. So
yeah.
does that mean like once a month you go off, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's generally 1 weekend a month, and then a period of 2 weeks in a year, your active duty. It's I'm ready to retire. It should be
Okay.
next year, hopefully.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you for your service.
Well, it's something that was very good for me as a young woman that didn't really know what I wanted to do, and probably spent a little more time babbling and playing around than I should have at that age. But it was very good for me. So.
And did you decide on going into the Navy because you come from family that is from the Navy?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, I'm a third generation sailor. So
Wow.
my father and grandfather.
And so now sailing looks different because we don't actually sail as much. We use,
Yeah, no.
You know how to sail too?
I know some marlin spike seamanship, but the really interesting thing for me is to read these texts that were written about personal experiences in the 1830s, 1850s. You recognize so much from your own experience 10 years ago, and it's sort of remarkable how the feelings, the emotional responses they tend to be the same. There's something about the sea that just it sort of presses people into the same response, if that makes sense.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I
think so.
I know I'm very interested because I have an interest. I've written, actually, you can see one of my books here has actual.
Look at that.
Yeah. And this is some of my work as a historian is looking at the intersection of the African diaspora and Islam in the Indian Ocean world. And so this is from a 12th century manuscript. I mean, it's not a very accurate depiction of what the ships that they use there, which are called dhows, which you may be familiar with. They're sort of triple sort of latrine sails. They're called dhows, DHOWS.
Write this down.
Yeah, but there's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine called Dhow Cultures of the Indian Ocean. I think that's what it's the name of it. But if there was one book I would recommend to learn about the cosmopolitan nature of these seafaring communities in the circum-Indian Ocean world. And so I don't know enough about sailing, except my college roommate was a sailor, and he took me out to a little lake, and he just said, pull on this, do this, and I was like, what? And we were cutting right into these, we were tacking, I guess.
Yeah, right.
Into the wind. And I was like, what?
No, it's remarkable. And the technology that to discover this sort of ability to manipulate the wind
Yeah.
and waves, obviously. But no, I'm actually really interested in the idea of the way people who don't know anything about sailing, the way sailing affects a culture,
Mm,
regardless of whether your average person has any
yeah.
idea about. But that's very interesting. I didn't mean to hijack this to talk to you about sailing, but that's
Oh
very
no, it's all interesting in some ways, I mean, everything is interesting if you start
yeah,
to ask questions about it, right? Um,
yeah.
that's fascinating. I didn't know that you were coming from a Navy family, the things you learn about your colleagues. It's
The
lovely.
things you learn, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like I said, it's a family tradition, and it's something that I hearing my grandfather tell stories,
Yeah.
obviously that's the immediate past, but I think that's when I first became sort of aware of it, because my grandfather and father would tell the same sort of stories, of World War II and
Mm,
Vietnam, and it was the same.
mm.
Um, and then of course I go to sea and the Indian Ocean, as a matter of fact. I spent a lot of time there.
Oh,
Um, and Okay, so we actually have a legitimate question
all right.
from Mike Harris. He says, Omar, I've
Mike.
enjoyed. Oh, you can read it. Can you read it?
Oh yeah, I can read it. It says,
Okay.
Omar, first of all, hi Mike. Nice to read your words. Omar, I've enjoyed in past years your conversations on stage with Rian and Giddens, etc. Any events like that? Your interview here on Beth's reminds me of that. You're so great at drawing out great conversations.
Can concur.
Well, it seems like the key to creating good conversations is to ask questions, right? And I think that's the way in which we can be generous and giving to each other, is just to ask us more about questions, because oftentimes I think the way conversations go is it's more like, okay, blah, 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 blah. And then you're waiting for that person to stop talking, where you can then insert what you really want to say, as opposed to listening to what they're saying and asking more and asking more. So I think that's one thing. Thank you so much for that, Mike. I've always found you to be so observant and affirming. Cynthia says, love the importance of babbling and play, which are so necessary as the well of the older person expressing the language to be learned. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we kind of poo-poo, which is a very technical word, the idea of babbling, but I think that it's okay. We work out our thoughts in many ways. Artists oftentimes have to kind of just paint things until they figure out what is it that they're trying to express. If you can always tell dancers, because they're always sort of like moving, right? They're always sort of like, moving, because that's the way that they express. So it's important for us to just kind of babble until we figure out what we're doing or not, and just keep that process going. Anonymous attendee, that's a great name. Anonymous attendee. I didn't even know that was like a last name, attendee. It sounds French. Is it French? Attendee. Anonymous attendee. Okay. How could I respond to a relative whose approach is the know-it-all to any subject that is discussed? Oh my gosh, I love this question, Anonymous. Anonymous, what I would say is ask them to say a little bit more about what they mean when they say X, Y, or Z. So Beth, start talking about some random topic, or a topic that you love, either one. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have been in the Navy for 20 years, and I've served on an aircraft carrier and done 3 deployments to the Middle East area and
So
Western Pacific.
that's really interesting. So when you say deployment, what do you mean by that? And okay, so we're good.
Yes.
The point here is take some element, Anonymous, about what your relative is saying about whatever topic, they're being a know-it-all about whatever, and say, when you say blah, and I take it that the know-it-all, usually when people talk about know-it-alls, there's a negative connotation to it. They're like, oh, I know it all, right? So you take some aspect of what you're saying, which might seem that you might actually completely disagree with, and say, can you say a little bit more about that? Or, ask for clarification. It's amazing. But here's the key, Anonymous, is not to be committed to any particular outcome. To, in some ways, savor the process that you're in of doing this human activity with the other relative. This is in some ways the antidote to those challenging conversations with relatives whose views you have different, and then you're sitting around the Thanksgiving table with, or the holidays, or whatever. Just ask more questions.
Curiosity.
Yes, sort of exude curiosity, but you have to do it in a sort of like in a meaningful way. Let's see here. Oh, I see a lot of things. Thanks. My chat is disabled somehow, but I can ask questions. Oh, there's Mike. And then, anonymous was Martha in Washington State, class of 66. Oh, thank you, Martha. What do you think about what I'm saying? Because sometimes people are like, I want to convince them of my position, but that usually, your job is not to convince. Your job is to build intimacy with other human beings. And in the process, you're going to probably learn some stuff, and you might have a better shot of helping them see things slightly different. Beth, were you going to say something?
No, I totally agree with everything you're saying. I think curiosity can be very disarming, and it can diffuse situations that are tense, like you're talking about, as well as, enable you to possibly learn something you didn't know.
Yeah.
And Omar, I know that you have to get out of here. So I don't want to make you late for your next thing. But we are so grateful that you took the time to come and talk to us today. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation, Beth. And thank you all, Mike and Martha in particular, for your questions. And I hope you all have a beautiful rest of the day. And again, Beth, thank you for the invitation. It's nice to participate in this conversation to the extent that we're able to with the technology and everything. So thank you. Take care, everybody.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, Cynthia.